Good afternoon, or good morning, or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to the call told. My name is Dr. Tom Day. I'm a lecturer here in the history of art with a focus on media and film art, and especially American art after the 1960s. And I teach an MA course on New York in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, which covers art and activism and film and video. And I teach broadly on undergraduate courses on art in relationship to media and mass culture. So what I'm going to do today as a part of a kind of taster session, taster lecture for you, is just to briefly go through one of my lectures, a portion of one of my lectures, which comes from a series of lectures that I give on the history of art and its relationship to mass culture, media, and politics after the 1960s. So what we're going to do is just share my screen, and I'm just going to take us through for about half an hour or so some key questions about the history and the sort of critical conceptions of pop art, especially as they were being made in North America and South America and beyond, actually, from the 1960s onwards. So what I'm going to do is just share my screen, and I will pop this up. Okay, so hopefully you can all see that. So I'm calling the lecture as part of a wider series called Art, Mass Culture, and Media since 1960, as I've said, and this lecture specifically is about the rise of pop art and its sort of explosion in the 60s, and then its movement latterly into different spheres of geographical and cultural production beyond just Europe and America, where it first emerged. So the aims of the lecture, just to give us a sense of what's going to be happening and what we'll be engaging with, is to first understand some of the origins of pop within its context in the United States. I'm going to just be doing this for the sake of this lecture. When you actually would take a course about this material, we would actually start much, much earlier and think about the history of pop art in sort of pre-war contexts, in its relationship to modern art in Europe, and then also about its emergence in the 1940s in Britain. But here we're going to focus on the 1960s, and we're going to examine some of the ways that pop art was received by critics and commentators and establish some of the key figures working within these environments. And we're going to begin to introduce how pop art operates in relationship to the broader artistic avant-garde, that meaning the broader artistic experimentation and new ideas, vanguard ideas that are happening and taking place during this period. And then we're going to close out by looking at some of these examples of more politically engaged pop art from around the globe since the 1960s. So we're going to take it in kind of three parts: what it is, where it might be coming from, what its origins are, how it actually works, what it looks like, and what that looks like in relationship to other types of art that are being made at the time, and then to think about how it could be used as a kind of political agency. So I would imagine that most people might have some ideas in their head when I say the term or use the words pop art to actually help us think through what this might look like. And one of those things that might come to our head immediately is works of art that look like or take as a kind of model and represent images from consumer culture, from advertising, from mass media, from films and television, from popular culture. So this is art that's very much concerned with representing to us aspects and images from our daily media life. And at the time in which the art movement began to be established in the 1960s, a lot of the objects and ideas and images that were being shown and depicted in these works of art were things from common culture, everyday consumer culture, things like tomato ketchup bottles or boxes of them, things like comic book strips, or things like film stars that were being shown in a new area, a new arena. They weren't being secluded off into a world of mass entertainment and popular culture, but they were actually being imbricated. That means they were being brought into a realm that previously didn't actually have much time or actually think of this as being a legitimate thing for art to take as a subject, for art to make work about, for artists to concern themselves with. And one of the things that was controversial about pop art was not only that it was choosing to focus on what we might call a vulgar or low aspect of cultural production that is emerged from the popular arts, but the way in which it seemed to actually not necessarily present a kind of opinion on these things or have a kind of agenda or have a sense of an interpretation of this work. It's a simple representation of it, showing it to us almost in exactly the same way as it's already been seen in these popular idioms. And this is a very complicated topic because, as you will see if you were to take further lecture courses on me with this, we actually see that artists were very careful to very subtly manipulate and shift around different things in the models that they're taking. So Lichtenstein, for instance, Roy Lichtenstein, the American artist, who modeled his paintings often in the 1960s after comic book strips and frames and panels within comic strips and comic books, actually changed quite significantly the look of what he was doing and used different dialogue and inserts different types of text and language to actually change the register of what's happening in the work. And you can see this by examining different examples of his source material versus the finished product at which he presents as a painting. And this idea that he's simply duplicating images is something that can be unpacked and problematized by our historical thinking when we actually learn about his technique and how he was doing this. He would never simply copy the images with tracing paper or project the images onto the canvas and then make his marks over the top to sort of create an exact replication of them. He would actually go ahead and make his own drawings of the comic books by freehand on his own. Then he would project those, his own images, onto canvas and turn them into paintings. So he's kind of commenting on the idea of mechanical reproduction, on the idea of the mass production of images within art practice. And he's doing some quite complicated things. So pop art, I would suggest, it is actually a much more kind of complicated and more elusive and dynamic realm of image making and fine art production in this context than often is discussed. And it's something that this lecture series does takes as a kind of core area for investigation. We would look at things, complicating it again in terms of not just thinking about making things look exactly like they did in real life, but turning them into slightly more disturbing or abject or unpleasant imagery that becomes actually kind of tactile and visceral in the way that it presents itself to the world. This isn't just a straightforward copying of things, but is actually a kind of intervention. It has a kind of perspective on this culture that it wants to present. Maybe it's something that is actually kind of skeptical of things like fast food culture, it being this idea of it not necessarily being a healthy or even pleasant thing to engage with and consume. We might also like to see the frame expanded and widened to not think about such canonical or important male artists, but also think about how female artists thought about pop art and used pop art as a register through which to think about how women are positioned by popular culture, especially by films and by this apparatus and the ideology of cinema as a kind of cultural behemoth that is often using women as a spectacle and seeing them as a kind of representation purely of men's desires, and that this is always a position of power that's being employed in this realm of vision, and how this can be attacked or subdued or in some way kind of subtly engaged and interrogated by female artists, by figures like Rosalind Drexler, who makes film related pop paintings that comment on the idea of cinema as a kind of dream factory, as a kind of realm or space for fantasizing and for creating phantasmagorical and inherently unrealistic images of women and of female actors. We might also see with a course like this, for instance, the engagements with popular culture actually also do not necessarily rest on the idea of taking something and representing it in a realistic or knowable or immediately recognizable manner, but actually uses different techniques and forms of image making to render the image more abstracted, to make it less coherent, less legible, and make it more an instance of using codified means, that is well-known means of making images like abstraction that was popular at the point at which pop art was being made, with figures like Franz Klein, Barnett Newman, Jackson Pollock, or artists who were affiliated with what we call abstract expressionist painting, how you could take these ideas and put them to use thinking about the realm of popular culture, the degradation of images, the kind of unbelievable pressure put on personas and the images that they filter out into the world that ends to them having a kind of horrible and in some cases tragic existence, as is the example from Wolf Vostel, a German artist who made several works of art about Marilyn Monroe, the famous actor who had a very tragic life and was one of the first examples of someone being persecuted and almost prosecuted openly in the mass media for living her life. And she was one of the first kind of tabloid paparazzi sensations. And it ultimately led to her having a very unbalanced and ultimately tragic life. If we think about it in relationship to abstraction, we can also think about pop in relationship to another movement that was beginning to burgeon at the time that became popular, which we call minimalism, in which you use this idea of repetition or grids and the idea of paring an image down to its most basic principles of seeing things in seriality, one thing after another. It becomes this kind of compelling but also very repetitive and boring aesthetic that was in its own way a commentary on consumer culture, on mass media, and on the deadening effects of living in a hyper-consumerist capitalist society after the Second World War. Here we have an example from the German artist Peter Rohr and his use of simply taking cutouts from advertisements from magazines and placing them one after the other in this kind of almost like inertia-inducing grid-like structure, which is being simulated and borrowed at the same time and fought in relation to other artists who are making purely abstract sculptures using these kind of similar ideas, in which they're looking to think about the idea of how art can make you experiencing the space that you're seeing it in differently, how it can make it change the way that you relate to objects with your body. And this idea of it being something that you can actually engage with on a kind of physical level is something that the pop artist took as a kind of cerebral thing, something that takes place in your mind. It can actually become an arena for thinking through the culture in which we live. Okay, so we'll just do a little bit of context because these are kind of, loose ideas, but they're fairly, hopefully there in terms of seeing the diversity of what is available to think about in relationship to pop art. And I'm just going to take us into the American context quickly because we don't have time to do the whole history of sketch pop from like the late 19th century and through. What I want to do is just give you some of the sense of the more exciting works and some of the kind of engaging works that you could engage with in this area. So we'll focus on a couple of figures from America. So by this point in the late 1950s, pop art had already started to emerge in Britain, especially in relationship to a group of artists and writers called the Independent Group. And they were very affirmative of popular culture. They thought that things like mass media, magazines, comic books, films, they thought that this stuff was kind of almost liberating, and it allowed you to think and talk about different subjects that you couldn't in normal art. And the idea that this wasn't being taken seriously was just a holdover of a kind of hierarchical, class-orientated snobbery, and that actually embracing popular and mass media was itself quite a radical thing to do and quite progressive, quite politically engaged. So similar things were beginning to happen also in America. So two key artists that I'll just highlight here would be Jasper Johns, who is still alive, was born in 1930, and his sometime partner and lover, but ultimate collaborator also on a number of projects, Robert Rauschenberg. So it's not commonly thought of to think of them as together, but they had a queer life together, and that is something that does underpin some of the works that they made. They began to create works which included everyday products, signs, and symbols, both as subjects of the work. So the work is about like the symbol of, as we'll see, things like the American flag, because it's a common iconographic image, and objects that they themselves place onto the very fabric of their paintings and canvases. So things from the real world actually begin to be placed onto their works, much like how Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso actually placed pieces of newspaper and bits of textile and fabric from the world onto pieces of paper, onto canvases to make collages. Johns and Rauschenberg were actually thinking much more expansively about turning this into a sort of almost a default aesthetic of painting, that it was real painting of reality had to incorporate three-dimensional objects from the real world to make these kind of hybrid works that aren't quite paintings and aren't quite sculptures. Rauschenberg called them combines. So they pioneered this, and I'll show you a couple of examples in a moment. They were soon followed by a raft, a big group of painters who rigorously reproduced the look of consumer goods and mass cultural products, from food packaging to Hollywood heartthrobs, as we've already seen with some of the examples I've just shown you. By the early 1960s, artists such as Thomas Wesselmann, James Rosenquist, and Wayne Thiebaud took to employing clean lines, bright and primary colors to articulate this vision in a manner not too dissimilar from industrially fabricated designs. So they began to make paintings and drawings and sculptures that often mimicked the look of things like advertising, of things like billboards, hoardings, magazine advertisements, and layouts. So the idea that these things are sort of replicating these is more than just saying, I'm going to make a painting of this. I'm going to try and make a painting that looks exactly like this, is one of the things that comes up in this beginning movement of pop. So we have figures like Rauschenberg, and this is one of his early combine works, Charlene from 1954. And if you just take a note of a couple of things in the caption I have here, that the work is made of a real massive range of materials. It's not just paint on canvas, oil paint. It is, but it's also charcoal, bits of paper that have been added to the canvas. You can see in the image here in the middle, there's bits of newsprint and newspaper. There's an umbrella even affixed to the canvas on the top right passage of the canvas. And then there's a light, a working light on the left-hand side, almost secluded into its own frame within a frame, that actually is plugged in. And if you see the work, which is currently in the collection of and on display at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, if you ever go there, you would see it. You can see the light bulb brightly on. And the work is also, the thing to notice, is rather large. This is a quite impressively scaled piece of art. It's very wide and quite tall. So it takes up almost the entire wall in which it's displayed. So it's quite all-encompassing. So it's like it's taking over the space, both of your visual field, but also of the actual physical environment in which it's situated. So it becomes a kind of way of breaking the boundaries down between what Rauschenberg wanted to achieve, which he said that his paintings, he wanted to be as much about life as they are about art, and they use life to make art. So they collapse these distinctions. This isn't something that's like a rarefied thing that can only be spoken about in hushed tones and thought through as a kind of like contribution to the eternal sort of discourse on fine art practice that's separate from the day-to-day experience of us going out onto the street and buying a light bulb, or going out to the street and breaking our umbrella. To Rauschenberg, there's no distinction between art and life, and this is sort of the project that he's wanting to enact with these kind of works. He also pioneered, in some ways was a pioneer of, but there are many other artists that can claim this. There's a Greek-American artist called Chryssa, who probably actually more acutely pioneered this as a type of practice, which is using screen printing, which is borrowed not from the world of fine art practice, but from commercial art, which was often a way to make posters very quickly, in which you would push ink or paint or some kind of other substance through a very fine net or mesh, like silk mesh, which is on a frame, and you push the ink through it, and it would, on the mesh would be the imprint of an image, and the ink would sort of force itself through the fine holes in the netting, and it would transfer the print that was impressed on the silk onto a surface, usually onto a canvas or onto a screen or onto a piece of paper, to make images very quickly, but also kind of sporadically. The images wouldn't transfer exactly like perfectly. There would be gaps and pieces of clotted paint or pieces of ink that didn't quite make it through, so you end up with this kind of sketchy look. But Rauschenberg employed this, and each of the images on this canvas are different prints that he's done on different areas of the painting, of iconic things that were taking place during the period in which he's making the work. So the ascent and then eventual assassination of JFK, John Kennedy, who was the president of America. And then we have this image on the top hand left of a astronaut. So it's placing this idea of aspiration, but also of like death and problems that are undergirding the sort of overbearing like cultural impetus of America at the time. So it's kind of becomes kind of a wry political commentary as much as it does a kind of arena for experimentation, aesthetic experimentation. His colleague and, as I said, one-time partner, Jasper Johns, was also interested in taking what he thought of as key everyday images and replicating or reproducing them as paintings in ways that make them both extremely familiar but also very defamiliar. So he would turn things like the American flag, of which he made many examples of different types of paintings, and he would have them be produced not simply as a one flag, but they would often make them with collage and newsprint, as if to suggest that America is made of lots of different stories, different things, different aspects, elements, and people. And he would often make it a multiplicity of images sandwiched one on top of the other. So it kind of defamiliarizes it at the same time as makes it very obvious what's it about. And in this way, he's kind of questioning the condition of what makes a subject of painting, what makes an image and not an artwork, what transcends this realm of art and life. So it's again similar kind of cerebral kind of ideas that are being engaged with by Rauschenberg, but they're being sort of thought through on a sort of more stripped back sensibility. But one of the things that quickly emerges from this, and as you can tell through the sort of materials and subjects that these images are having as their sort of concerns, is this sense of pop as being a kind of form of realism. Like it's about real life. It's about things that are happening in the world. It's about things that you yourself can engage with. You don't have to be wealthy, or you don't have to be living in a certain place or part of the country to understand these things. These are part of our mass consciousness, mass mediated consciousness. They're things that we understand through the news, through television. They're things that we understand through living in urban environments, for instance. These are kind of things that are coming on. So this idea of a kind of an art movement that's concerned with investigating the visual culture of the common, things that are common to the contemporary world. And it's reflected in early group exhibitions of the movement. So first attempts to put together these different artists that are working on this sort of similar subject, they start giving them titles like new paintings of common objects, or phrases start to be used like the new realism to describe what pop art was. And another key term that doesn't take off, and all of these sort of are trying to make their way as the key term before pop sticks, is commonism, that these are things that are common, but at the same time, it's a kind of pun on communism, as in like the idea that everyone is equal, or everything is treated as if it's distributed evenly and there's equity between things. This idea obsessed people like Andy Warhol, who thought of things like Coca-Cola and brands like Brillo and Heinz as being common to everyone, that they're available to everyone and they're at the same price for everyone. So they have this kind of open up this kind of tendency for thinking about a collapse between the East and the West also, which is an interesting thing that's happening when you think about the history of capitalism at this moment during the Cold War, which is something that in the longer version of this course we get into in a bit more detail. So at the same time as it's being taken as a kind of realism, pop is also being taken as a kind of critical and perhaps kind of subversive even group of works and artists. It's tendency is towards being a bit skeptical of the common culture, to being skeptical of the capitalist realism of the everyday object and consumer politics that we're dealing with here. This is reflected nicely in one of the first ever exhibitions of pop, which is called My Country, 'Tis of Thee, which seems to speak that this idea that this represents, especially in the North American context, this represents the United States now. This is us. It's a reflection of us and our culture. And as I've already said, the title of exhibitions like New Paintings of Common Objects. And you would have things like Jim Dine's actual incorporation of real objects into paintings, and the idea that the work itself is collapsing these distinctions and boundaries was something that was common to a lot of the artists. And then you have these kind of more fractured or fragmented pictures by figures like James Rosenquist, which seem to suggest that all of this is kind of taking place at once. It's like watching television or watching a film. We're constantly shifting between loads of different visual cues, and we're constantly being bombarded by an outrageous amount of visual stimuli, which are often being used to sell us things, often being used to market us or place us into a consumptive mode of living and of being in the world. And it's very interesting to think about this now as the sort of like beginnings of what we would now think of as like the hyper digital internet culture of distraction and of constantly having our own attention turned into an economy that's sold back to us as our data is harvested to sell us things and advertise to us through our online and social media presences. So this kind of stuff is really kind of provocative, but at the same time it's kind of very much a kind of preview of like what will happen to the visual economy of capitalism going forward. So far I've glossed this as being a kind of quite positive, if critical kind of grouping of artworks and artists, that these are quite skeptical and taking quite an askance look at the world in which they're engaged, and they're quite critical of it. This is not how it was received necessarily by art critics and art journalists and writers at the time. I'm just going to give you a great example of an early piece of writing on pop art that was a review of several exhibitions that took place in New York in the early 1960s. Figures including James Rosenquist, who I just showed you with the cigarette and the headlight, the fragmented picture, Klaus Oldenburg, who was the creator of the hamburgers that I showed you towards the beginning, and Jim Dine, who's the figure who had the tools suspended on his canvas at the top in that image I just had up. So Max Kozloff was writing on this group of shows. I'm saying here a clutch of New York gallery shows held during the late winter of '62. Including these artists, and he was acerbic in his distaste for the subject matter chosen by the pop artists, but he was also equally disparaging of the popular culture. So he hated both the art, but also what the art was about. So in that way, he's saying this is not legitimate kind of subject matter for art. It's not something that art should be concerning itself with. And he's worth quoting here as he finds pop suspect. He finds that he's skeptical of it in both its affirmative guise, right, and is in the idea that it's celebrating this world, it's celebrating movies and comics, it's celebrating popular music, and also he's also skeptical of it if it's being critical of it. So he kind of has it both ways in this way. He speaks first of Summers talking about Rosenquist paintings, which this was an example. And Rosenquist, before he became a fine artist, selling his work in galleries, he worked painting advertisement signs, big ones, big billboard advertisement hoardings in New York. So his techniques and his trade that he learned in that context, he transposed into the fine art world and often made very, very large paintings. So he says, are we supposed to regard our popular signboard culture, by which he means this advertising culture, which is on the streets and on highways and can be seen like every day in these urban environments, with greater fondness or insight now that we have Rosenquist, right? So now Rosenquist has decided to make art about this, or taking this as a model, what we meant to now think of these boards he's suggesting? Or is he exhorting us to revile it? Does he think that he's saying you should hate this? You should, I'm being critical of it. You should hate this stuff. This disturbing, and it's turning us into sort of mindless zombies consuming things to do what has come naturally to every sane and sensitive person for years. So he's basically taking Rosenquist to task to saying, like, you're just criticizing something we've already always thought of this as a problem. You don't need to tell me. You don't need to make art about it. It's actually kind of not very subtle or clever of you to do that. You're just pointing out something to me that I already agree with you, is essentially what he's saying. If the intent is pathological, so if he's pathological, if he thinks we should be celebrating this culture, and if the second, dull, so Rosenquist is not doing anything interesting, basically. The truth is that art galleries are being invaded by the pin-headed and contemptible style of gum chewers, bobby socksers, and worst, delinquents. So gum chewers meaning young people that are into popular culture. Bobby sockers is a particular term about people who are obsessed with popular music like rock and roll. And then he's saying that at worst, these people are delinquents, which is a kind of conservative moralizing about like what would have been like youth gang culture that was especially pertinent to the context of New York in which Kozloff was writing and living at the time. Not only can I not get romantic about this, right, about this art and these artists, I see as little reason to find it appealing as I would an hour of rock and roll into which has been inserted a few notes of modern music. So his conclusion, or his pointing towards this idea that not only do I find this art terrible, but everything that is associated with this culture, regardless of its opinion, good or bad on this, is not something I have time for. It's not something that's actually a measured intellectual kind of way of engaging with these bigger questions about life and art. It's too ephemeral, it's too day-to-day, it's too popular. It's not actually something that is a kind of rarefied experience. So he basically hates it, right? And he, if we want to look further, then he says the title of the article is called Pop Culture, Metaphysical Disgust and the New Vulgarians. So it's safe to say that Kozloff is not a fan. This stands in contrast to the way that some of the artists were thinking about what they were doing. And it also stands in contrast to some of the other critical reception, as I'll point towards, and then we'll go on to talk about some of the political ramifications of pop as we close out. So in a rare artist statement, like a straight statement about what he thinks his art is about, which he did not offer many, Andy Warhol, famously hard to pin down and kind of performative in his interviews and in the way that he talked and commentated on his own practice, conflated pop's potential for both affirmation, as in for both celebrating this culture that they live in, and for critique, for sort of attacking it and seeing it in a kind of potentially more problematic manner and regard, while also presenting his art subjects as a matter of fact, right, as a product of a consumer society ready to be interpolated by and become worthy of artistic interpretation. If it's out there and you're living with it and living amongst it, Warhol suggests it's a legitimate thing for us to make art about. He said, and this is the quote, "I adore America, and these are comments on it," his works he's referring to. "My image is a statement of the symbols of the harsh, impersonal products and brash, materialistic objects on which America is built today. It is a projection of everything that can be bought and sold, the practical and impermanent symbols that sustain us." So Warhol is suggesting here, and I think quite pointedly in a way that he doesn't in any other attempts to sort of think through what his art is doing or what it achieves, is to say that this is the reality we live in, though. So as much as you might not want it to be something to be considered in an intellectualized or an aesthetic way by art practice, nonetheless, the fact that I exist and I'm making this work, and there are these groups of other people who are making this kind of stuff and on these kind of topics, means that actually it is a legitimate form of art practice, and it is a legitimate subject for which fine artists can think through. So this is kind of something that is slowly taken up and actually gets reflected in different things. So figures like I can't remember his first name. Albert Preston, I think, or just Joseph Preston, was at the New York Times, was also writing a lot about art and pop in this period, reviewed another early pop shows, which also reflect on this idea of it being a kind of realism in its title. Said it was called Six Painters and the Object, which was at the Guggenheim Museum, which is a major museum in New York, and it was curated, the exhibition, by one of the curators of the museum, Lawrence Alloway, who was British and also one of the first people to be writing very affirmatively about popular culture in the 1950s. Stuart Preston wrote in the New York Times that pop art was a form of biting satirical commentary with, quote, the monstrous solemnities of American culture in its crosshairs. It was taking aim at the ridiculousness of American consumer culture. He said, we can only be grateful, he writes towards the end of his piece, for these genial jesters and their pointfulness in deflating balloons. The deep, dark secret of pop is that it is anti-popular with a vengeance. So he takes a kind of almost directly opposite opinion and position to that of Kozloff, in which he suggests that actually the pop art is very much invested with looking down on this culture in some way, in attacking it, and into saying that it's actually a kind of ridiculous spectacle that needs to be deflated like a balloon, like it's just a big ornamental spectacle that can be easily undone and attacked if we show it for what it is. And some of the works that were included in that exhibition, for instance, include paintings like Roy Lichtenstein's Ice Cream Soda, which looks a bit frothy and ridiculous and over the top, which is kind of pointing towards this direction that Preston is suggesting, and works that are slightly more complicated by figures like Warhol, which is a painting of his, one of many paintings he made about body modification and about the new industry, and all of them were modeled after newspaper advertisements that he found for people to go through cosmetic and plastic surgery. So the idea that the culture itself was not just selling a kind of ideal life through material consumption, but actually through bodily transformation, and the idea that you can be a better person if you change the way you look, and that the idea that the entire culture is predicated on the surface of things and on the look of things is something that Warhol was very interested in and engaged with throughout his career. So I think that we could sort of tie some of this together in terms of thinking about pop as being about realism, about a kind of new reality of living in this consumer environment and mass cultural sphere, by looking at one more quote, which is by Marshall McLuhan, who is an early pioneering theorist of media. He wrote a lot about television and he wrote a lot about mass media culture in the 1960s. He was writing about, in an essay about pop art, about the ubiquity of pop by the mid-1960s, how pop itself had become an extremely popular style and an extremely popular way of seeing things, and it was being adapted by advertisers, it was being placed in magazines, it was becoming a kind of shorthand for a kind of hip, in the know, kind of slightly askance way of looking at popular and mass culture. But this idea that it becomes so much part of the environment itself is something that he thought could highlight the artifice and emptiness of its commercial or mass cultural subject matter, right? So pop could make us aware of the shallowness of our own hyper-mediated modern environment, which serves only to propagate aggressive consumerism. And McLuhan wrote, pop art serves to remind us that we have fashioned for ourselves a world of artifacts and images that are intended not to train perception or awareness, but to insist that we merge with them as the primitive man merges with his environment. The world of modern advertising is a magical environment constructed to produce effects for the total economy, but not designed to increase human awareness. Pop art is the product of drawing attention to some object of our own daily environment, as if it were anti-environmental. So it's a little bit complicated, but what he's essentially trying to suggest is that taking pop art and looking at what it is actually showing us, is that it's showing us that this world is one of problematic suggestion, interpolation, and almost manipulation, that it's actually trying to say that our entire environment is just one of signs, symbols, and marketing to get us to be kind of passive consumers, to be passive subjects that don't engage with the world in a kind of more heightened or aware of actually being critical or skeptical of things. And he's saying by purely reflecting this, pop is showing us that that is what reality is. And I just want to take this and run with it a little bit to expand across a different number of artists who also were looking to think about, like, okay, well, what is this environment or this reality? Is it really reflective of who I am and how I relate to the world? Figures like Mel Casas, who's an important Latinx artist and part of the kind of Latin American political sphere within New York City at the time, in the early 70s, is making his own version of pop art in which he's attacking the popular culture and, by de facto, some of the way that that culture has been seen by white pop artists as an overbearingly white and sort of non-multicultural, non-racially diverse sphere of cultural production. So comic whitewash, which is a great work by him, in which we have the kind of abstracted brush gestures of, it's a reference to a Roy Lichtenstein painting, of being purely white, as in the artists that are making this are purely white. And then all of the superheroes from the various comics that are often taken as models for these paintings and works by figures like Roy Lichtenstein are all overbearingly white also. So there's this like idea of where is the space for other people, where is the space for minoritarian or for oppressed individuals and minorities to actually have a space within this realm, within mass culture. And you'll see that by having the figure of the boy here is actually placed down towards the bottom of the canvas. He's not centered as a subject of a sort of painting would normally be. He's actually placed at the margins in this kind of provocative manner. Sometimes this is taken as a much more sort of visceral, kind of blunt gut punch of a work, something like using the symbols and signs that are often found in popular art and pop art, like targets, which was a major symbol used by Jasper Johns, taking that and placing the target on the t-shirt of a boy who is a child of color, and suggesting that they have a target on their back within this culture, that they are targeted to be consumers, but they're also targeted in the sense of this sort of now decrepit and sort of not clean poppy landscape, but the actual reality of where you find consumer advertising in this kind of rundown or kind of peripheral and precarious space of urban life, which is actually going to expose you to potential violence, expose you to potential exploitation, and that the culture industry and the advertising industry are all in cahoots in kind of creating this kind of oppressed atmosphere. Even slightly more abstractly, James Rosenquist, the painter who I showed you earlier with the cigarette and the woman's mouth and the cars, use this kind of reference to like barricades and revolution and radical political activity and even war in these kind of more lesser known and abstracted sculptures, which directly refer to political upheavals and events that are taking place in the 1960s, like the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968, which was a very violent series of protests and clashes between protesters who were dissenting and advocating for an end to the war in Vietnam, and a kind of militarized wing of the police who would, without any kind of qualms, be driving into loads of crowds of people with these horrific barbed wire shields on the front of jeeps and vehicles. This idea of like pop art also being about what's within the populace and like a sort of populism of radical politics is also something that's kind of hovering in the background here. And I'll just close by pointing towards some other examples from different places. So these are mainly American examples that we've just been discussing, but we have this other idea of pop that it was never just something that was taking place in America and in Europe. It was taking place in other places, in South America, in Japan, in Australia, in Southeast Asia. So it has this kind of, always had this kind of globalism to it. It's always been a global movement, but actually that's been a belated thing. It's not come until much later that we've actually understood and begun to process this. And it's happened since really in the past 10 years, because there's been a sort of veritable glut of pop retrospectives across continents. There's been 4 massive exhibitions, Pop to Popism in Sydney in Australia, Post Pop at the Saatchi Gallery in London, which is about pop art in Eastern Europe and in Russia, international pop at the Walker Art Center and the World Goes Pop at the Tate Modern, both of which tried to throw light onto especially South American and Japanese pop art. So that they've all placed this sort of significant emphasis on pop from around the globe with works from these countries, as I've said, China, Japan, Russia, Ukraine, Brazil, Argentina, displayed alongside, so in conversation with these sort of traditional Anglo-American and Western European counterparts. And often the tendency towards these exhibitions and towards a lot of the art that's being displayed in these conversations is to have them as being kind of quite political works, quite sort of committed and subversive works that are not speaking about popular culture in this sort of affirmative way, but using it, or advertising culture, using it as a like a weapon or as a way to weaponize a way of thinking about these kind of things like attacking major sort of fossil fuel companies like Esso, which is a big gas and oil company, and comparing it to a kind of like an unreality of an acid trip with LSD, which is Ovid Faldstrom, who's actually a Swedish artist. And then South America, which is something I'll turn to now, actually had always kind of quite politically committed radical engagement with pop aesthetics. So during increasingly dictatorial regimes in Brazil and Argentina, pop artists engaged in political resistance, even as they enjoyed fashion, sexual licentiousness, and expressed a desire to drop out of modern life. This is from a quote from Esther Guevara, who is the curator of an exhibition that happened quite recently in the past few years called Pop America, which is about pop art in Central and South American countries. And some works are kind of quite well known from this context, and this is perhaps one of them, which is Claudia Mireles, which is Insertions into Ideological Circuits, the Coca-Cola Project, which is an amazing kind of pop provocation, agitprop, almost propaganda work, in which glass bottles of Coca-Cola, which still in many countries are recycled. So you simply recycle the bottle and it gets sent, cleaned and refilled with the beverage and then returned to the store to be bought. He would have the Coke bottles, drink the Coke, and then add to the thing various messages or symbols. So you'll see the one on the left, it says Yankees go home. And then in the middle, it's turned the side of the bowl into a series of instructions of how to create a Molotov cocktail, an incendiary, like homemade DIY explosive device that can be used in the event of revolution or against the oppression of the people by the dictatorial regime, which Brazil had at the time. It's now in the collection of the Tate. It's reminiscent of other works that are being used that weaponize racial symbolism and racist iconography, like Aunt Jemima, who is a famous sort of antebellum slave period icon of sort of willing enslaved older woman who's looking after plantation staff and slaves, that has been for a very long time, hundreds of years until recently, used as a symbol on syrup bottles and maple syrup style products in the United States. And Betty Saar, who's an African-American artist based on the West Coast of America in California, uses this and turns it also into a kind of weapon, a sort of ready-made object that upends and inserts into its own ideological system a criticism of these pervading media images. So in this case, Coca-Cola is seen as a sort of globalism, imperialist American company that's turning its heels and digging its claws into markets and the sort of the matrix of ideological and iconographic symbolism in different countries being turned against itself. And you have similar images where racist companies using imagery is also turned into a kind of weapon against its makers. Hugo Rivera Schott, who sort of summarizes this kind of tendency of the militant nature of this kind of art, said we always thought about it as being explode America, blow up America. In that sense, pop as onomatopoeia. So in the work Pop America, to blow it up, to sort of like to be against it in this kind of incendiary, radical, and almost militarized way. Some of the works are kind of more subversive or satirical in the way that they conflate the sort of nuclear American, like 2.4 children, like bourgeois family, with this kind of deadening existence of conformity, using these images and collages to compare them to Kool-Aid and the Kool-Aid family. But also at the time, you have this sense of Kool-Aid being something that was being employed in cults, and forcing people to drink it to make them conform, which is a famous thing that happened in America, where a cult leader forced lots of people who were following him to drink a Kool-Aid, which is a beverage that you can make by mixing powder with water, but he poisoned it and they all died. So it's this idea that you will blindly conform to the point of being like in not just an inertia of your own consciousness, but your own death. So this idea that like conformity and under capitalism is a problem, is something that is coming up constantly. And I'll just close with two further examples, one from China, which is an area where pop art has actually become very popular since the 1990s and since the sort of liberalization of China's economy and its opening up to Western markets, in which we have examples where artists have taken this kind of iconography and imagery from the Cultural Revolution and like the Maoist uprisings in China, and blending them in this kind of ironic way with the icons of advertising and of major fashion brands and corporations in Europe especially. So this is a quote from Xiaoming Lu. They, the pop artists, have become a part of an upper middle class in the changing Chinese economy. The artists no longer strive to produce a confrontation with authority, and the public as their predecessors did. They have changed from elite amateur avant-gardists to professional careerist artists. The nationalism and materialism of political pop, based on the transnational political and economic circumstances, share common roots with government policy, and the art is in a position of complicity. So here we have an example where it's gone the other way. Instead of this being a kind of militant separatist kind of agenda that's against mass culture, these works have become popular among collectors, and they've actually become to be signal works within the renaissance of the Chinese art market, and that they have actually been co-opted as kind of a perfect marriage of iconography from communist China with like popular and desirable luxury brands to themselves. So they become wedded in this way that isn't critical, but is actually conducive to a kind of propagating of the ideological status quo. And I'll close with this because I think it's a fun work. Alexander Kozloff's Hero, Leader, God, which also kind of marries this idea of the state's control versus the cultural, like sort of imperialism, and the kind of religious level of kind of dedication that is expected to both within the capitalist realm, is kind of perfectly and parodically, sort of searingly sent up in this amazing sculpture, which was included in that show, Pop Art East Meets West. So I'll close it there. It's just a sort of preview of the kind of material that I cover in some of the courses that I teach here at the Courtauld. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you do wish to contact me, you can find me on the Courtauld website, Tom Day, my staff profile, and email any questions you have. I'd love to hear from you, but thanks so much. I'll stop sharing my screen, and thanks for listening.